MysteryWire.com, home of the unusual and unknown. From Area 51 to the paranormal, it's your source to the most vetted UFO stories and special investigations in the world. Take a journey into the universe of MysteryWire.com.
Hello and welcome to On the Record. Reports of strange, inexplicable animal mutilations have been filed all over the world, including here in Nevada. Who's behind it? What do they want? The person who's probably done more research on the topic than any other is journalist Linda Moulton Howe. Howe earned a master's degree in filmmaking from Stanford University, specialized in documentaries about science, medicine, and the environment in major television markets, and currently does special projects for the cable news network. It was while working for the CBS affiliate in Denver that she first began hearing about bizarre mutilations of cattle and other animals.
The kind of surgical excision that was being described in the articles made me think in the beginning, is it possible that there is some sort of an environmental contamination problem like the Doug White Proving Ground sheep scandal of a few years earlier, and that the government, for some odd reason, was going out into the grazing fields where these animals actually ate and were taking parts for analysis. Right off the bat, one of the first people that I talked to about that very issue was Carl Whiteside. He was head of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. He had 2 or 3 boxfuls of files from Colorado on mutilated animals. And when I raised that question, he said, Linda, I've worked for the government. If the government wanted to analyze tissue from cattle, they would buy the cattle, they would take them to their own private federal, whether it was a military installation or federally owned lands, they would do whatever testing that needed to be done on those animals, and no one would ever hear about it. So the argument came back at me right at the get-go from a man in charge of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation that it was preposterous to even consider that the government was involved. And the next step beyond that was when you sit and across from, literally as the film went on, from hundreds of people, ranchers and law enforcement and the few veterinarian people who would talk to me off the record. I never got one who would talk to me on the record. And you hear all these stories about these silent, in many cases large, football field-sized, orange glowing lights over pastures where mutilated animals are found. And then you get eyewitness reports, like Waco, Texas rancher. His son called me because his father, who was an old rancher, had been ranching 40 years, had been out trying to round up some pregnant cows out of a ravine in Texas, encountered 2 approximately 4 foot tall, the color of mesquite leaves is what the old rancher told me, which is kind of a green, with slanted, solid black eyes, carrying the 2 creatures he described were walking in tandem with a calf like this, swinging between their 2 arms. And the rancher was so frightened when he saw this that he just ran away, and it took him 3 days to get the courage to go back with his wife and one of his sons. And there, at the same place, they found the calf, and it was completely and totally eviscerated. Only the hide was left, and the skull bone was inside the head, and the hooves were on. But it had been neatly excised in the stomach and turned and folded inside out like this, with the head and the feet very neatly together in the ground. And next to it was the backbone of the calf minus all the ribs. And that old rancher said to me, who were those creatures? And why would they do this? And those are the questions that have haunted ranchers and law enforcement now. It's been almost a quarter of a century since the first mutilation was reported worldwide in 1967.
You start investigating this, it gets progressively weirder, I guess, and people really are reluctant to talk about it at all levels. Why is that? They don't want to be labeled kooks?
Fear and ridicule. Why humans do that to each other, why they accept that so easily as a tool, as a weapon against each other, I really don't know. Because when you actually go out, I've walked these pastures. I have been in some of the most remote areas of this country. I've seen 7 of these animals myself. you know that when you're facing the fact of what you're dealing with, that it doesn't matter whether a newspaper says that it's a predator. It's not predator. And in 1989, we are now gathering evidence from more than half a dozen animals that the excision line from the whatever made the cut was done at 300 degrees Fahrenheit or above. The pathologist working with me and we can't say what it was that made it, but we know we're dealing with high heat, and that eliminates predator. The satanic cult issue comes up and has come up right from the beginning of this.
Let's save that one for a moment. For those in the audience who might not be familiar with the phenomenon itself, why don't you give an overview of how many of these cases there are, the animals involved, how widespread it is, and a typical case, what's involved, what happens to the animal?
The typical excisions in a pattern, especially in the 70s, because there have been subtle changes every once in a while, is one ear is gone. Usually there's a circular patch in the head where the ear has been excised. The eye is removed, and in many cases in the mutilations I'm talking about, it's a circle about this big, and it's perfect, like with a compass if you drew it, and everything from here up to here is removed, and that includes the eyeball, and in several cases, and one in particular, a veterinarian said that the optic nerve had been removed perfectly and cleanly from inside the brain. The jaw is usually stripped of flesh on a very straight line that comes either here and down, or comes around like this, and everything is removed. And the important point here is many of these animals have been found warm to touch. They're less than 12 hours dead. And yet the bone is as perfectly white and clean. There is no flesh, no blood of any kind. That's highly unusual. The tongue, in most of the cases, is cut deep within the throat in a vertical cut. You would have to open up here to see where the actual excision line was. The genitals are often removed in oval cuts like this in the male. It's just like a cookie cutter. It's just like somebody went stencil and it's removed, and all there is in the belly of the male is this oval. In the females, the udder might be removed. Similarly, it's just like a cookie cutter, and it may be sort of square or round and takes the udder, or a combination takes only the teats, very carefully, very specifically, and there's no blood. And the rectum is cored out as if somebody took a stovepipe, shoved it in, pulled it out 6 to 8 inches in, and everything is removed. That's the common pattern that has affected Canada, the United States, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Central America, South America, Australia, the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa, and several parts of Europe. And that same pattern, not just in cows, but in almost every domestic ranch animal that you could think of, and poultry, and birds on the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa. And this is where there were biopsy plugs that went right through the feathers, made these very strange plugs in the birds, and wild animals, deer, elk, marmots, raccoons, possums.
Could predators or even devil worshippers somehow be responsible for the mutilations? More on that when we return. Why would someone cut up an animal in the manner described by Linda Howe? And who could accomplish it? Howe says there have been witnesses to the slaughter.
There have been, in the Judy Doherty case, which is in my film A Strange Harvest, she was one of 5 people frozen in time in a car. She seems to witness the actual excision of parts of a calf that she saw being taken up in a pale beam of light. It's the little grays, the big black eyes, and they seem to be impatient even with her questions about why are you doing this to this calf. And they feed back to her throughout all of this experience that there is something in our plants and in our animals that is a problem, and that they're tracking it, and that all of this whole big story, whatever we're doing, it's affecting them. And that comes full circle back Are we in a symbiotic relationship with an alien life form that may live underground here or lives I don't know where in the far reaches of space and makes one-way trade routes here because there's something about life, DNA on this planet that is precious or special for them? It's so illogical. This is the whole problem with this whole story. We've got the evidence of all these carcasses, all of this eyewitness testimony of human beings that I cannot dismiss. Worldwide, creatures, eyewitness, broad daylight, not human, alien life forms involved with something to do with the mutilation of an animal in a pasture. The evidence is there, hard testimony is there, but when you get to why, if we're dealing with an alien life form that's not communicating with us directly and actually doesn't seem to want us to know exactly what they're up to, then that might explain why it is so difficult to answer the question, what could this possibly be being used for? All of this fluid, all of these parts.
Thousands and thousands of animals. There's really no way to tell how many.
You'd have to go into every sheriff's office, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Mexico, Puerto Rico, all over, and say, can I have all of your files? And even then, because I know from experience, that for every report that reaches the sheriff's office, there may be 3. One sheriff said, Linda, you have to multiply by 3 what's in my office files to even get close to what actually is happening in my county because so many ranchers won't report it.
You finally did get some law enforcement people and in rural areas for the most part to talk to you. What is their view on it? I mean, obviously they've got to be alarmed. Obviously ranchers have got to be complaining about this happening.
In 1990, it's still going on. There are reports in many places in the United States. 1989, there were so many in Idaho that Sheriff Brent Bunn in Bear Lake County there said, Linda, I haven't seen anything like this since the mid-70s. Well, there was one guy, Lou Girodo. He was the chief investigator in the district attorney's office in Trinidad, Colorado. And one night at around 10 o'clock, my photographer and I sat across from a desk from him, and I asked him the same question I had been asking sheriffs everywhere. Who or what do you think is killing and mutilating these animals? And to my surprise, he said, well, other colleagues of mine and I, we've come to the conclusion we're dealing with creatures that are not from this planet. He's the only one who ever went on the record with the camera running to tell me he thought we were dealing with some sort of alien life form, while others, perhaps understandably, would tell me bizarre stories off the record. Why is there so much silence on the part of the government in response to legitimate questions about what are these silent lights that leave dead and mutilated animals in pastures?
Some investigators have stated that predators such as coyotes or crows are responsible for the mutilations, or that devil worshippers are behind it. Howe disagrees.
Well, predators don't have 300-degree Fahrenheit temperature teeth. Crows don't have bills that can reach 300 degrees Fahrenheit on an excision. And when you have a medical pathologist, that's his training, and he's looking at tissue that under a microscope has all of the evidence of cautery, high heat. To me, that automatically excludes predator in any of those animals. Well, if it were just that simple little slice, and we just had, okay, 6 animals fit this description, but that's not the case. From 1967 to 1990, all over the world, the same kind of excisions, the same parts taken. And well, how can you say that's predator, let alone satanic cults?
What about cults?
Again, it was Carl Whiteside. Early on, sitting in his office in Colorado, he'd been knee-deep in all of these mutilation reports, and he said, Linda, we have put undercover agents from Colorado to California, He said, we have spent untold amounts of money and energy trying to get somebody who would give us any kind of information about why satanic cults are mutilating these animals. And he said, this is the first time in my career in law enforcement. He said, we haven't had one person come forth to claim any reward money. And we never found one shred of evidence that would connect satanic cults to what's going on. Now, Carl Whiteside is not going to say that he knows precisely what is happening. He just knows, I've got a lot of dead animals, and they've got a lot of strange cuts. But he himself eliminated for me cults in the government.
Considering how many mutilations there are, it just doesn't seem there are that many Satanists out there.
Well, and in my film, I show people how you go about setting up a laser instrument. So, and this is to address this question. If these cookie cutter cuts that have all the evidences of some sort of heat at the edges were being done by some kind of a laser instrument, I don't know what's doing it, but let's just assume. And in my film, I show a team of 5 or 6 trained people in a surgery room setting up a laser to do surgery on a human. It took them about 30 minutes. We're talking hundreds of pounds of equipment. It's extremely delicate and sensitive. It takes a very long time to even make one small excision. People are going to drag that kind of equipment out to the far ends of Colorado and South Dakota and set it up and do this on the animals. And I was like this pilot of a helicopter at Fort Carson. He said to me, it's much easier for us who fly helicopters at that point it was Army, Fort Carson, to imagine, and he said, aliens and UFOs coming down here and taking these cattle up in some beam of light and excising these parts and putting them back down than it is for us to imagine anyone flying around with a lot of helicopters picking up these animals. And that was from a guy who's a pilot of a Cobra. So you've got strange markings in the ground, and you've got eyewitness reports to the lights, and you've got those eyewitnesses, broad daylight, of creatures down on a cow that is mutilated.
And there certainly aren't any tracks from humans in the area that you can find.
Well, then this is another important point. There was a cow that was found on a wet sandbar in the middle of a river, excised exactly as I told you, the bloodless, cookie-cutter, precise cuts, and there were no tracks around that cow, including the cow's own. But the cow wasn't wet. It wasn't like water had come and washed over everything. There have been animals found in the middle of snow, and there are no tracks around the animal, including the horse's or the cow's own tracks. And that was the first case in '67. That horse was found yards away from its last tracks. It was as if something had picked that horse up and put it down, and when it was put down, it was lying down flat. It never moved again.
So what's the big picture on the UFO mutilation mystery? More on that in a moment. A few years ago, Linda Howe's research into the animal mutilations came to the attention of HBO, which hired her to produce a program taking a broader look at the UFO topic. As part of her research, she was placed in contact with Richard C. Doty, an Air Force intelligence officer based in New Mexico. Doty, notorious in some UFO circles as an agent of disinformation, showed Howe an amazing document.
I could see that the top page, very formally, all caps, centered each line on the page said, briefing paper for the President of the United States of America on the subject of identified aerial vehicles. And as I sat down into this big chair and I looked at this next page, it began with a summary of dates and places where our government had retrieved discs, silver discs, and bodies, both dead and alive, of alien creatures that were described to be about 3.5 to 4 feet tall, gray-skinned, no ears, no nose, the slits, and the big eyes. And that from one of those live aliens that they had retrieved from a crash in Roswell in 1949, and had been taken to Los Alamos National Laboratory, where it stayed until June 18, 1952, when it died of unknown causes. That was a phrase I remember from the paper. The paper proceeded to summarize information that had been learned from this live extraterrestrial biological entity is the term, and the acronym that the government chose to use apparently in the 40s was EBAS. That was the acronym. Some of the information that the rest of the paper contained was a historical summary starting with Project Sign all the way through so many projects that you've already very well gone into in your TV series. And it ended up with a last page of projects. Project Snowbird and Project Aquarius, Project Sigma. Project Sigma was defined as ongoing communication with these extraterrestrials, and it said this project is ongoing to date, which I saw in April 9, 1983. There was another paragraph that said, all questions and mysteries about the evolution of Homo sapien on this planet have been answered and this project is closed. Whether or not these several pages that Richard Doty handed me at Kirtland Air Force Base, April 9, 1983, represents partial truth, a lot of truth, I don't think that you can say that everything in that paper was complete misinformation, because it echoes too closely the information in the so-called Eisenhower document distributed by Bill Moore. It echoes too closely the information by Robert Lazar, the physicist who I believe has worked on a craft at S4. It echoes very closely material that has come out through the human abduction. And maybe as important as any, you, I, others of us who have gotten into this, who are journalists and in the media, we continue to get anonymous source information or highly confidential source information. You're never going to see them on television, and they're never going to allow themselves to be quoted. But they are coming from everywhere in very odd ways saying, this is right on, this information is true. And it always leaves me with this almost overwhelming feeling that we're sitting on top of an iceberg. And the enormous size and implications of the rest of that iceberg, that's what I'd like to know. I know, as certain as I'm sitting here, that Richard Doty handed me these papers, and it contained information that would be a surprise, I think, to most of the world to read if it were sanctioned by the President of the United States and other world leaders and military people as being the beginnings of a true picture of alien involvement in this planet, and that the alien involvement may have been going on for eons. Maybe part of the problem is that this is the story that cannot be told by government leaders easily, and that there's conflict even at that level about how do you communicate, right now at least a 40 years suppressed story, in bits and pieces. And maybe part of this, and maybe Richard Doty, wittingly or unwittingly, was part of this, he may have been used also, is you begin to filter out, both to grassroots and to media people, pieces and slices of truth, of real truth. Whether the dates are absolutely correct, whether the specific strategy or the scenario is absolutely correct, I don't think that is as important as what is the overall story that is surfacing from so many places.
And the overall story is, I mean, the bottom line?
Aliens have been involved with this planet for a very long time, and there's evidence today to suggest that they are still intruding themselves on this planet in human abductions, animal mutilations, and probably in other ways we don't know.
Linda Howe is currently based in Atlanta and says she hopes to one day convince cable news network to commit to a much broader treatment of the UFO and mutilation topics. Anyone who would like more information on these topics or who would like to write to Howe can write to us here at KLAS-TV. The address is in your phone book. Thanks for joining us. See you next week with more of On the Record.
you.